They told him not to write. They feared what he might say. But in a rain-soaked bunker on a dying island, Lieutenant Masato Kura broke that rule and wrote the truth Japan never wanted the world to read. July 15, 1944. Lieutenant Masato Kura opened his weathered leather diary one final time inside a half-collapsed bunker on Mund Bay, New Britannia Island. The candlelight flickered against the damp earthen walls, casting a trembling shadow across his face. His hands shook, not from fear but from exhaustion and the unbearable weight of what he had seen during the past 3 days. Outside, the jungle murmured with the low growl of artillery far to the east. The faint echo of explosions rolled through the night like distant thunder. Every sound reminded Kura of the inevitability of what was coming. He knew by dawn the enemy would be upon them, and this diary, forbidden by regulation, would become his final act of defiance against silence. He wrote with deliberate strokes, his handwriting disciplined despite his fatigue. He recorded not heroism, but reality. The decay of men and spirit under the crushing hand of starvation, disease, and systematic destruction. Each page of his journal was not a report for command, but a confession to history. He described the smell of rot that clung to every breath, the pale faces of soldiers who no longer resembled warriors, and the futility of courage when pitted against an enemy whose power lay not in emotion, but in organization. Kura had come to realize a truth that no military academy had ever taught him. Bravery without system was suicide. As the night deepened, he paused to listen. The rain began again, soft at first, then heavier. A steady rhythm drumming against the tin roof of the bunker. Somewhere in the darkness, a wounded soldier murmured in delirium. Another coughed until the sound faded into the hum of insects. Kura dipped his pen again and continued to write. The Americans, he wrote, do not fight like men. They fight like machines. Their strength is not in courage, but in their systems. Their fire arrives as if commanded by a single will. Their movements are exact. Their supplies never fail, and we are dying not because we lack spirit, but because we lack what they have. A way to sustain that spirit. When the candle burned to its final inch, he closed his diary gently and pressed it against his chest. In that fleeting warmth of light, he whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for understanding. He wanted someone, someday, to read these words and see, beyond the myth of valor, to see the truth. Written by a soldier who had learned too late that courage alone could not hold back a storm of steel and system. The flame flickered once more, then died. The bunker fell into silence, leaving only the sound of rain. 3 weeks earlier, Lieutenant Masato Kura and his men had arrived at Mund Bay, a small outpost carved into the dripping green hell of New Britannia's western coast. The humidity was suffocating. Even the rifles sweated. Their mission was simple on paper: to defend the western approaches to the Munda airfield, the final Japanese stronghold on the island. But from the moment they landed, Kura sensed that defense was a word that no longer meant survival. The platoon under his command was officially listed as reinforced, though its strength barely reached 80 men, a mix of exhausted veterans from Manchuria and young recruits who had never fired a shot in anger. They carried rifles older than themselves and wore uniforms that clung damply to their skin. The jungle, thick with ferns and mist, devoured everything. Sound, movement, morale. Kura's orders came from the 9th Fleet headquarters, which had already withdrawn most of its naval units northward. The so-called supply convoys never arrived. Promised rice shipments were reduced to half, then a quarter. Ammunition crates sank with torpedoed destroyers before reaching the coast. The men built makeshift shelters from palm leaves and salvaged tin, praying each night that the next sunrise would bring a ship on the horizon. None ever came. Every evening Kura wrote by candlelight in secret. Personal diaries were forbidden, the act itself punishable by court-martial. But he felt compelled to document what official reports would never mention. The slow death of an army not by bullets, but by neglect. He noted the progression of illness spreading through the camp like wildfire. The first fever cases appeared within a week. By the 10th day, More than half the platoon could no longer stand during roll call. The medical chest contained nothing but gauze, iodine, and the false hope of endurance. Without quinine, the men burned with malaria and hallucinated under the pale moonlight. At night, the jungle came alive with whispers, men muttering prayers, others cursing their fate, some crying out names of wives and mothers lost beyond the sea. Kura moved among them, speaking softly, hiding his own despair behind calm authority. He rationed the last of the rice, thinning it with boiled rainwater. 2 more weeks, he would tell them. The fleet will come. He no longer believed it himself. By the 3rd week, their strength had waned to the point of absurdity. Even carrying rifles required 2 hands. The few who still stood dug trenches that filled instantly with rain. Food was gone. The men chewed on palm bark and roots. The jungle, which should have offered fruit and fish, became their prison, its rivers poisoned by decay, its trees sheltering swarms of insects that feasted on open wounds. And yet, orders kept coming from headquarters. Hold position. Reinforcements expected. The radio operator laughed bitterly each time he transmitted the same hopeless acknowledgement. Kura wrote in his diary that night, "They command us to hold an idea, not a position. They speak of duty while eating warm meals on the other side of the sea. Out here, duty has the taste of blood and mud." He began to realize that courage, no matter how pure, was powerless against the weight of starvation. His men no longer fought the Americans. They fought the jungle, disease, and their own bodies. Every sunrise that did not bring relief felt like mockery from the heavens. By the end of the 3rd week, the platoon had ceased to resemble soldiers. They were specters in torn uniforms, waiting not for orders, but for the inevitable. At dawn on July 12th, the silence that had lingered over the jungle finally shattered. From the ridgeline east of their position came the deep, rhythmic boom of artillery. Not random shelling, but deliberate, measured fire that advanced in steady waves. Each explosion crept closer, as if an invisible hand was drawing a straight line through the trees toward them. Lieutenant Masato Kura watched through his field glasses from a muddy slit trench. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of cordite. What he saw through the lens confounded everything he had been told. The enemy moved with a kind of terrible precision. They were not the reckless, chaotic individuals that Japanese propaganda had painted them to be. The American infantry advanced in compact formations, disciplined and deliberate. Each squad covered the next. Their movements were synchronized with the relentless tempo of artillery fire that fell exactly where it was meant to. "They are like a machine," Kura muttered, lowering his binoculars. "A machine made of men." Behind him, his soldiers crouched in silence, clutching their rifles. Some flinched with every explosion. Others simply stared blankly into the fog. Their ammunition was limited to 3 clips per man. The machine guns, once their pride, had long since run dry of belts. Even the grenades were gone, tossed days earlier in desperate skirmishes with American scouts. The jungle that had once been their shield now betrayed them. Each blast tore through the trees, splintering trunks and sending fragments whirring like knives. The earth shook, roots tore loose, and the men pressed their faces into the mud as the bombardment rolled over them like an endless tide. When the guns fell silent, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the unmistakable clatter of rifles and the low hum of engines. American units moving forward again, cautious, unhurried, unstoppable. Kura noted the timing in his diary. The pattern of advance was exact, predictable, almost mathematical. "Their artillery," he wrote, "is not a weapon of destruction alone. It is a clock, marking each step of their progress. Every shell signals a movement. Every pause means preparation. We, by contrast, move by instinct, by emotion, by command shouted through smoke. They move by calculation." He looked at his men, gaunt faces smeared with mud, eyes hollow from fever. These were no longer soldiers of an empire. They were ghosts resisting the inevitable. Still, he ordered them to stand, to prepare for contact. They obeyed without hesitation. Even in hopelessness, discipline remained. By mid-afternoon, the Americans had closed to within 200 meters. Kura could hear their shouted commands, calm and clipped. Mortar rounds began to fall again, bracketing the Japanese line. His radio operator screamed into a broken handset. calling for fire support that would never come. The only reply was static. The enemy moved through the smoke like shadows, rifles raised, bayonets glinting. The fight that followed was short and brutal. Not the glorious clash of steel and spirit Kura had been trained to expect, but a mechanical slaughter. The Americans didn't charge. They advanced systematically, clearing each bunker with grenades, fire, and movement. When the shooting finally ceased, the jungle was silent again, but it was a silence that no longer belonged to them. Kura retreated with the survivors to a smaller bunker deeper in the ridge. He wrote by flickering lantern light that night, "I have seen the face of the enemy. It is not hatred, not even courage, it is efficiency. Their victory is not born of emotion, but of system. And that more than bullets is what will destroy us." By the second week of July, the line between the living and the dying had blurred beyond recognition. Lieutenant Masato Kura recorded each day with a detached calm that belied the horror around him. He wrote of soldiers who could no longer stand, of others who stared blankly into the jungle as though already part of it. Malaria had consumed the platoon. More than half were bedridden, skeletal figures shivering in the humid dark. The medical tent had become a place of waiting, not healing. The corpsman had long since run out of quinine and bandages. He now used strips of torn shirts to wrap wounds and whispered apologies he no longer believed. Every morning, 2 or 3 men failed to wake. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves behind the bunker, covered with leaves to mask the smell. The rice ration, once meager, had shrunk to a quarter portion. Kura divided each handful with mathematical precision, ensuring no man was cheated, though the act itself felt cruel. The grains were soaked in rainwater until they swelled. An illusion of abundance. The men ate in silence, their eyes hollow. Some wept quietly as they chewed, not from pain, but from the humiliation of being reduced to animals by hunger. Still, the orders came. On July 13th, headquarters transmitted a single curt message. Hold position 48 hours to allow evacuation of command staff. The static that followed was louder than the words themselves. Kura knew what it meant. No reinforcements, no supplies, no hope. His platoon had been written off as expendable. He gathered his remaining men that evening under the flickering light of an oil lamp. Faces gaunt, uniforms tattered, weapons rusted by the constant rain. He spoke quietly, his voice steady though he felt it breaking inside. "We have our orders," he told them. "We will hold." No one protested. They all understood. To resist meant nothing. To obey meant death. Yet they nodded because obedience was the last thing that still made them soldiers. Later that night, Kura wrote again. "They no longer ask when supplies will come. They no longer ask if we can win. They only ask how long they must stay awake. I have nothing to give them but words." The next morning he watched as men too weak to lift rifles dragged themselves to their posts, propping weapons against their knees to appear ready. One collapsed mid-sentence while reporting to him. Kura simply helped close the man's eyes and continued his inspection. Emotion was a luxury long abandoned. The jungle, once deafening, now felt eerily quiet. Even the insects seemed to sense the end approaching. The rain fell ceaselessly, washing mud through the trenches and carrying away the blood of the sick. When darkness returned, Kura divided the last of the rice into equal portions. "Eat slowly," he said, though there was hardly anything to eat. Some men smiled faintly, as if grateful for the lie. Others stared blankly at their bowls, unable to move. That night he wrote his most haunting line. "We are ghosts waiting for dawn." The enemy is not the American soldier. It is hunger, fever, and the silence of our own command. He put down his pen and listened to the rain beating on the bunker roof, steady and relentless. The sound of time itself eroding everything that once had meaning. The map on Lieutenant Masato Kura's table was little more than a sheet of paper softened by humidity and sweat. The edges curled, the ink bled where raindrops had fallen. Yet that crumbling map represented the entire reason they were dying here. The small patch of airstrip marked Munda. From the beginning, every plan, every sacrifice, every death had been in service of that airfield. The generals back in Rabaul called it the key to the central archipelago. If Munda fell, the Americans would command the skies over New Britannia and the surrounding seas. For Japan, it was not just a tactical position. It was a symbol of will, one they could no longer afford to lose, and yet could not hope to keep. Kura's outpost sat on the western approach to the airfield, a labyrinth of mud trenches, decaying bunkers, and shattered trees. The men who still fought there were the remnants of the 9th Fleet's ground contingent, about 8,500 soldiers scattered through jungle strongholds. The airfield itself was pocked with bomb craters and corpses, the once smooth runway now a ruin of churned earth and twisted metal. Every day, the thunder of American artillery echoed from beyond the ridge, precise and relentless. Their aircraft circled above with mechanical patience, their bomb runs cutting through clouds with surgical precision. Each raid was followed by a silence that felt like judgment. Kura studied the enemy's rhythm with professional fascination, even as his world collapsed. The Americans advanced not in fury but in process. They moved supply by water, cleared jungle by fire, and coordinated every assault with perfect communication. It was to Kura a new kind of warfare, one that turned human beings into extensions of a greater machine. They fight as if every bullet, every step, and every man were part of a single design, he wrote in his diary. We, by contrast, fight as fragments, each unit alone, each soul isolated by the jungle. He had once believed that the jungle would be their ally, a natural fortress favoring defenders. But now it felt like a trap, devouring both sides without mercy. The vines concealed snipers and snakes alike. The humidity rotted weapons faster than they could be cleaned. The men no longer feared the enemy's bullets as much as they feared infection, dysentery, or the fever that burned through their ranks every night. Supplies, once promised by the Tokyo Express, had vanished months earlier. American submarines and aircraft hunted the convoys before they even reached the islands. The sea itself had turned against them. What little remained, rice, ammunition, medicine, was hoarded by command staff, or lost to jungle rot before reaching the front. By early August, the once proud Japanese garrison had become a collection of starving ghosts. Kura's platoon represented the larger army's condition, worn down not by defeat in battle, but by decay from within. The soldiers' uniforms hung loosely on their thin bodies. Their eyes gleamed with fever or madness. Some muttered prayers to ancestors. Others stared blankly at the ground, lips moving without sound. Still, Kura maintained his rituals. The morning roll call, the daily report, the salute to the rising sun that no one could see through the clouds. These small acts gave structure to chaos, even as the meaning behind them slipped away. That evening, he wrote in his diary, "Munda is no longer a place. It is a wound that bleeds men and reason alike. Every day we hold it, we lose another piece of ourselves. But perhaps this is what it means to serve. To obey even when logic has surrendered." He folded the map carefully, though he knew it no longer mattered. The airfield would fall. Everyone knew it. What remained was to endure, not for victory, but for the memory of those who already had not. By the time August 5, 1944 arrived, Lieutenant Masato Kura's diary had become both a record and a requiem. Each page carried the tone of a man who no longer expected to live, only to be understood. His handwriting grew thinner, his sentences shorter, as if even the act of writing cost more energy than he could spare. It was on that day that his final entries began to reveal, with brutal clarity, the complete disintegration of his unit. Out of the 80 men who had arrived with him 3 weeks before, only 25 could still carry a rifle. The rest were dead, delirious, or unable to stand. Some had gone blind from fever. Others wandered into the jungle and never returned. Those who remained fought not for the empire, but for one more breath. The medical corpsman, a quiet man from Osaka who had once dreamed of becoming a doctor, had taken his own life a few nights earlier. Kura found his body near the edge of the camp, sitting upright with his pistol still in hand, a note tucked into his uniform pocket. It read only, "I cannot watch them die any longer." Kura recorded the event without emotion, though he admitted in his diary that something inside him had cracked when he read those words. The bunker smelled of damp wood, sweat, and decay. The single lantern burned low, its light too weak to drive back the darkness. The walls were lined with makeshift shelves, ration tins, a few bullets, and a rusted medical kit. The sound of coughing echoed constantly, a rhythm of suffering that filled every pause. Each day followed the same routine. Roll call at dawn, ration distribution at noon, silence by dusk. Kura still required his men to salute, though he knew the gesture meant nothing now. Discipline, he wrote, is the last illusion of control. The last rice delivery had come on June 24th, nearly 6 weeks before. Everything since had been scavenged. Roots, insects, anything remotely edible. The men boiled strips of leather from their boots, softening them into foul broth. Some scraped moss from stones and ate it in secret. When the rainwater ran low, they drank from puddles dark with soil. And still, they obeyed. When Kura ordered a perimeter check, men too weak to walk crawled to their positions. When the artillery began again, they did not flee. There was nowhere to go. That night, Kura's diary became less a military record and more a confession. He described his own exhaustion in cold, analytical terms. The tremor in his hands, the dizziness that came with every movement, the strange detachment with which he watched his men die. I no longer feel fear, he wrote, only distance, as if I am observing our deaths from somewhere beyond the body. The jungle swallows us one by one, and I can do nothing but take notes. He described a fever dream he had 2 nights earlier. Standing on the runway at Munda, surrounded by thousands of faceless soldiers. The sky was filled with searchlights, the earth trembling beneath endless marching boots. But when he turned to call out, he found that his voice made no sound. The army kept marching, silent, mechanical, endless. He woke from that dream with tears on his cheeks. He did not know why. On August 5th, just before sunset, Kura closed his diary after finishing a final page. The words were simple. This is no longer war. It is disintegration. We are dying not from defeat, but from absence. Of food, of medicine, of meaning. Yet still, I write. Because someone must remember that courage existed here, even if it achieved nothing. He pressed his seal into the damp paper, folded the diary into a waterproof pouch, and placed it beneath a loose plank in the bunker wall. Then he sat for a long while, staring at the flickering flame of the lantern until his vision blurred. Outside, thunder rumbled again, not from the sky, but from the American guns drawing nearer. On the morning of July 11th, before the final collapse, Lieutenant Masato Kura had filled several pages of his diary with what read less like a confession and more like a military study. Even as the world around him disintegrated, his training as an officer compelled him to analyze. He dissected the battle not as a participant, but as a scholar documenting the anatomy of failure. He wrote about the American artillery first, how its precision seemed impossible to human eyes. Through his field glasses, he had observed the pattern. Bursts of fire that landed in perfect intervals, rolling forward like a wave of thunder and smoke. There was nothing random in it. Each barrage was synchronized with infantry movements, each pause matched by repositioning. The Americans, he realized, did not fight by instinct, they fought by system. Their fire is mathematics, he wrote. Each explosion follows a rhythm, each rhythm a purpose. Their observers speak to their guns as if to a living thing, adjusting, correcting, perfecting. We, meanwhile, fire into fog, hoping that courage might compensate for precision. The contrast gnawed at him. Japanese artillery crews still relied on prearranged firing tables and guesswork. Communication between front and battery was slow, often non-existent. When shells fell, they were as likely to hit empty jungle as enemy positions. Kura had studied strategy at the Imperial Military Academy. He knew what coordination should look like. But in New Britannia, doctrine was meaningless without the system to sustain it. He described, with almost academic detachment, the psychological effect of American fire. His men no longer feared battle itself, they feared the predictability of the bombardment. Every morning at dawn, the first shells arrived without fail. Every afternoon, another wave. Between them lay the terrible silence of waiting. It is not the noise that breaks them, Kura wrote. But the order. The realization that even destruction obeys logic, while we obey chaos. He noted, too, how the Americans moved behind their fire, slow, deliberate, shielded by coordination. We were trained to meet an enemy who rushes, who shouts, who bleeds like us, he wrote. Instead, we face one that advances with patience, crushing us beneath routine. That evening, he gathered with 2 other officers, both pale, trembling, their uniforms soaked with rain. They discussed almost philosophically what this new warfare meant. One said the Americans had no soul, that they fought like machines. Kura disagreed. Machines do not build such systems, he said quietly. Men do. Men who understand that efficiency is the truest weapon. In his diary, he expanded on that thought. Our empire believes in the sword, in the shout, in the moment. Theirs believes in the line, the crate, the code. They win because their courage is collective, not individual. Each soldier is one part of a greater body that does not tire, does not hunger, does not forget. He could not help but admire them, even as their fire destroyed his position piece by piece. There was beauty, he thought, in their discipline, an artistry of logistics. He felt no hatred for them, only envy for the structure that made them invincible. As night fell, the jungle lit up again with artillery flashes. The air rippled with concussions. Kura's men pressed against the mud, praying beneath the steady rain of steel. He kept writing through it all, his pen moving in rhythm with the explosions, recording what would later be recognized as one of the most lucid accounts of modern warfare written in real time. If Japan loses this war, he concluded, it will not be for lack of bravery. It will be because bravery has become obsolete. We are fighting an enemy who has turned organization itself into a weapon. He closed his notebook and stared out into the dark, where the sky pulsed red with distant fire. For a brief moment, he felt as if he were standing at the edge of history, watching the old world, his world, collapse under the weight of a new one made of systems and precision. On the evening of July 12th, the message arrived through the crackling static of the field radio. A short, impersonal command that would seal their fate. Hold your position for 48 hours to allow evacuation of headquarters personnel. Lieutenant Masato Kura listened as the operator repeated the order to confirm receipt. The young man's voice trembled, not from fear, but from disbelief. Everyone in the bunker understood what it meant. They were not being reinforced. They were being abandoned. The rain had not stopped for days. Water dripped through the roof and gathered in shallow puddles across the floor. Kura sat at his small desk, the paper before him damp and spotted. He stared at the words he had just copied from the transmission log. Hold position 48 hours. It was an absurdity. His men could barely stand, let alone fight. The order was not strategy. It was ritual, a formality uttered by those who would soon sail away to safety. He did not curse his superiors. He no longer had the energy for anger. Instead, he wrote, "Command has confused endurance with effectiveness. They mistake stillness for strength. They believe that to die in place is to serve the emperor. But death without reason serves nothing at all." When he gathered his men to deliver the order, they stood silently in the rain, faces hollow, uniforms clinging to their skin. No one questioned him. They saluted weakly, some barely able to raise their hands. In their eyes, Kura saw neither fear nor defiance, only acceptance. They had long since learned that survival was no longer their duty. That night, he tried to write to each of them individually, recording their names, their hometowns, the fragments of humanity that war had not yet stripped away. One soldier asked him to write a letter to his mother. Another wanted his diary burned with his body. Kura promised them both, though he knew neither request could ever be fulfilled. At midnight, he gathered what remained of the rations, a handful of rice, a few withered roots, a tin of dried fish that smelled of rust. He divided it equally among the men and called it a final meal. They sat together in silence, chewing slowly under the dim glow of a lantern. Someone began humming an old folk tune, and for a fleeting moment, the bunker felt almost human again. Outside, thunder rolled. Not from the sky, but from the American guns preparing for another advance. Kura knew what would follow: artillery, then smoke, then the methodical push of infantry. His men would hold for perhaps 2 hours, maybe less. The outcome was predetermined, written not in courage or cowardice, but in logistics. He opened his diary once more and wrote, "If I obey, we die. If I retreat, we are erased. I choose to obey, because obedience at least leaves a trace." In the early hours before dawn, he organized the platoon one last time. He distributed ammunition, though there was little to give. Many of the rifles were rusted. Some had no bolts at all. He instructed the men to conserve fire, to wait for close range. They nodded, though none expected to survive. As he moved through the trench line, Kura paused beside the bodies of those who had died days earlier. The rain had softened their features until they seemed to sleep. He whispered to them, as though reporting for duty, "We will hold as ordered." When the first shells fell at dawn, the ground erupted in fire and mud. The bunker shook violently, the roof beams splintering. The men fired blindly into the smoke, their cries swallowed by the roar of artillery. Amid the chaos, Kura remained at his post, shouting commands that no one could hear. By mid-morning, half his remaining soldiers were gone. Still, the others fought not to win, but because the order said to hold. Kura wrote later, during a brief lull in the bombardment, his final observation of that day. "Discipline is stronger than fear. It keeps men standing long after reason has fallen." As evening descended, the guns quieted. The jungle burned in patches, its smoke curling into a darkening sky. Kura sat among the ruins, too tired to move, watching the flicker of flames against the mangled trees. "We held," he whispered to himself, "and in holding, we vanished." The dawn of July 13th, 1944, came shrouded in smoke and mist. The jungle that had once pulsed with the sounds of life now breathed only fire and death. Lieutenant Masato Kura sat against the bunker wall, his uniform drenched, his eyes red from sleeplessness. Around him, the survivors of his platoon moved like ghosts, slow, silent, stripped of everything but the reflex to exist. He could hear the American artillery repositioning in the distance, the metallic clank of barrels, the soft hiss of radio chatter. Even the enemy's movements carried precision. There was a rhythm to it all, as if each soldier were a cog in some vast engine of war. Kura had learned to recognize the pattern. The guns would open at 8, roll for 2 hours, then stop exactly long enough for infantry to advance. The consistency was terrifying. By mid-morning, the bombardment began again. The earth convulsed under the assault. Trees exploded into splinters. Bunkers caved, the air filled with soil and the stench of gunpowder. Kura shouted orders over the thunder, though he knew most of his men could not hear him. Some had already dropped their weapons, clutching their ears, lost in panic and pain. Others fired blindly into the smoke until their rifles jammed from the mud. He crawled through the trench to reach the forward line, a cluster of sandbags that no longer resembled defense. From there, he saw them. American soldiers, advancing in perfect intervals, rifles steady, movements synchronized with their supporting fire. They paused, fired, advanced again. Each step was deliberate, measured, inevitable. "They fight like the tide," Kura wrote later that afternoon. "They advance without hatred, without fear. Their courage is not felt but engineered." The fight lasted barely 2 hours. The Japanese guns fell silent one by one. The few remaining defenders were too weak to resist. The final explosion came from the bunker behind Kura. A direct hit that sent him sprawling into the mud, his ears ringing. When he stood, dazed and bleeding, he saw that half his trench had vanished. The few who remained alive looked at him for orders he could no longer give. He stumbled back to the command post, where his diary lay open on the desk. He sat, trembling, and wrote his last coherent entry. "We have fought bravely. Yes, every man here has done what honor demanded, but courage is no longer the measure of victory. The Americans have built a system, a network of precision, supply, medicine, and order, that makes our valor irrelevant. Their machines do not tire. Their food never runs out. They're wounded live. Our courage dies hungry in the mud. Outside, another round of shells fell, shaking the bunker. He ignored it. His hand moved slowly across the page, each word deliberate. The Empire teaches that spirit conquers all, but spirit does not feed the soldier. It does not cure fever. It does not carry ammunition through the storm. The Americans have learned what we have forgotten, that war is no longer about men, but about systems, and systems do not surrender. When the shelling finally ceased, a strange calm settled over the ruins. The rain began again, soft at first, then steady, washing the blood into the earth. Kura looked out through the shattered opening of his bunker and saw what remained of his men. Some lay still. Others stared blankly at nothing. He gathered them, the few who could still move, and spoke for the last time. His voice was calm, almost gentle. We have done all that can be done. You have shown courage that will never be remembered. But know this, our failure is not ours alone. It belongs to a nation that mistook slogans for systems. He helped the wounded into what shelter remained, tore his flag into strips to bind their arms, then sat beside them as night fell. In his lap, the diary remained open to the final page. With a trembling hand, he wrote, "Let whoever finds these words understand. We did not lose because we feared death. We lost because we fought an enemy who had learned how not to waste it." When dawn broke on July 14th, the last bombardment began. It lasted less than 2 hours. Lieutenant Masato Kura was killed instantly by artillery fire before the enemy reached the bunker. The diary survived, buried beneath the wreckage, sealed by mud and chance. 3 weeks after the fall of Mund Bay, American patrols combed through the jungle, collecting the remains of what had once been the last Japanese line of defense. In a collapsed bunker half swallowed by mud, they found a leather pouch sealed in wax, and inside it, a small notebook wrapped in cloth. The cover bore the faint imprint of a name, Lieutenant Masato Kura. The pages were damp, the ink smeared in places, but the words endured. When translated, they revealed not battle orders or patriotic cries, but something else. A cold, unflinching dissection of defeat. What those pages contained would later echo in the minds of historians and soldiers alike. A soldier's realization that courage had limits, and systems did not. Military intelligence officers read the diary in silence. Some dismissed it as defeatist, others recognized its brutal honesty. One analyst wrote in his report, "This officer understood more about modern warfare than his superiors ever did." The diary was classified and filed away in archives, forgotten amid mountains of reports. But years later, when scholars rediscovered it, they found in Kura's words the anatomy of an empire's collapse. He had predicted it all, not with bitterness, but with clarity. "The empire will not fall for lack of warriors," he had written, "but because its warriors have no system to sustain them." In the months following the battle, Munda Airfield became operational under American control. From its runways, bombers launched strikes deeper into the archipelago, pushing the Japanese fleet farther north. Each success followed the same formula Kura had described: coordination, logistics, and relentless organization. On every island that fell thereafter, his prophecy repeated itself. Courage crushed beneath machinery. Of the 80 men who had served under Kura, only a handful were ever accounted for. Those who survived the assault were found by American medics days later, skeletal, delirious, many unable even to speak. They were fed, treated, and interrogated. One of them reportedly asked an American doctor, "How do you feed so many?" The doctor smiled and said, "Because we planned to." It was a reply Kura himself would have understood. Historians who later studied the diary called it the document of disillusion. It stripped away the illusions of glory and revealed war as a contest not of souls, but of systems, of who could sustain their will long enough to make it matter. Kura's writings became required reading in military academies decades later, cited in lectures about logistics and morale. He saw the future, one scholar wrote, He saw that the age of the individual warrior had ended, and the age of the organized machine had begun. Yet amid the analysis and citation, something human remained in those pages. The quiet dignity of a man who had loved his soldiers enough to record their suffering truthfully. He had not glorified them nor pitied them. He had simply refused to let them vanish unnoticed. In his final words, Kura wrote, "Perhaps someday, another soldier will read this and understand that courage alone is not enough. Systems win wars, but men must still bear them." And so the diary of Lieutenant Masato Kura became more than a relic. It became a mirror, reflecting not only the end of one man's command, but the passing of an entire age of war. Even now, decades later, those who read his final line cannot escape its simplicity or its warning. The side with better systems will defeat the side with better slogans. The rain that had drowned his final night had long since passed. The jungle grew over the trenches, the bunker, and the graves. Yet beneath the roots and the silence, his words remained. Proof that in the face of overwhelming machinery, one man had still chosen to think, to write, and to remember. In the fading echo of war, Lieutenant Masato Kura's diary reminds us that true strength lies not only in courage, but in understanding, in learning from the past so it need not be repeated. His words, written in the dark, still shine like a single candle against the storm of history. If Kura's story moved you, support this channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing it with others who value untold history. Together, we keep voices like his alive, the voices that teach us that bravery alone can never defeat the machinery of war.